I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I was asked today to talk about journalists who seek to do a human story on the Palestinian people and the failure to understand that it is a story that cannot be told outside of its political context. The brief said, asking for equal time with the pro-Israel voices to give that context is often met with polite silence or cold rejection. What prevents the free press from giving space to views that challenge the dominant narrative? All of us who deal with the media are all too familiar with the challenges. Could you please insert a balancing sentence condemning Hamas bombing of civilians? An editor asked me. The opinion page is not a place for tit for tat, is what a senior opinion page editor of one of Australia's leading newspapers told me when I sought a right of reply to an article published by a spokesperson of the Australian Israel Jewish Affairs Council. Do you have any contact with people in Gaza who have been affected by the bombs, but who are also opposed to Hamas firing rockets into Israel? A reporter inquired of me. We would like to get both sides of the argument here today. We'll start with you first, Randa. Could we get your side of the story, and then we'll get the other side of the story? That's a typical radio interview. When I sat down to write this paper, I was tempted to offer a detailed discourse analysis of coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that speaks to the biased framing of the conflict in the establishment media and how aligning contexts serves to reinforce the Israeli narrative. While such work is incredibly important, what I want to do instead is try to mine deeper into the affective and emotional regimes that structure this desire for a human story. I've been involved with the media as a Palestinian advocate since I was in high school, some 20-odd years now. I've seen the gradual shift from almost no Palestinian voices in traditional media to a growing tendency to seek to offer balance, even by way of being more willing to allow a Palestinian reply, obviously within specific frames, constraints and conditions. Despite these opportunities, Palestine advocates face enduring obstacles in challenging the dominant narrative. What I want to do today is unpack this by interrogating what we are up against emotionally and ideologically. So first, the so-called human story, as a storytelling media device in coverage of the conflict, is often sought after for reasons such as humanising politics or providing a personal context to a political situation. The human story assumes a disengaged and disinterested audience who need to be gently coaxed into a state of feeling that arouses an emotional and moral engagement with Palestinians as outsiders, as distant sufferers. I know all too well what these human stories entail. They are supposed to be intimate meditations on the personal cost and toll of the conflict in the everyday here and now. What is your emotional state? How have you been affected? Confess your feelings to us, your dreams and aspirations. Tell us about your present and future, but leave out the past. What we need to ask about the human story is who is the human in this story and what is the story? I have spoken before about the traumatising moment when, as a Palestinian advocate, you realise that you are not the human in human rights is speaking for. Time and time again, international human rights law, the UN, our own governments, instill the expectation of universality in us all, and yet deny this universality at the very moment they encourage us to claim it. We are hailed into answering the call of humanity, of human, of everyone. But how many times is the call of the universal answered, only to be met with a brutal reminder that actually, no, you are not part of the universal. You, the Palestinian from Gaza, you, the Palestinian in Hebron, you, the Palestinian behind the wall, are not the human we mean by human rights. In our grand abstractions, polemics and speech acts, we talk about the universal, obscuring how particular it is in life and death. The stories, histories, lives, dreams, security, health and childhoods that are privileged are white. This is the way our world is structured. It is because of this fundamental exceptionalism, not universalism of human rights, call it white rights and non-white exceptions, that the cunning of the human story is exposed. When we are invited to offer a human story, it is only ever from a position that must answer to a white universal. Your story is therefore never self-determined. The plot points, scenes, genre, and even language are dictated to you because your story is not your own. It is only ever a reply, a defence, a cross-examination. And it is the benevolence and magnanimity with which this opportunity for a reply is offered that makes it all the more traumatizing and unbearable. What is the story in the human story when the human is the deviation from the white universal? This is when we start to see the deeply embedded emotional regimes in the media establishment. I want to focus today on two ideological positions or truths that act to edit the human story. Often, I might add, unconsciously, when we are talking about working with well-meaning left liberal journalists who are genuine about giving us a human story platform, but completely unreflexive about their white material and emotional privilege. The first position is about the notion of victimhood. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a struggle over land that will never be resolved if the competition over victimhood is not undone. I say competition because emotionally we cannot ignore the fact that for many people, the Holocaust created the Jewish people as the ultimate victims. Now, I do not say this to be disparaging or offensive. I was in Berlin only last year, and I wept as I walked through the Holocaust Memorial. The Israelis may have stolen my family's birthrights and homeland, but they have not stolen my capacity to ache for the suffering and injustice their people endured. My people's suffering should not cancel out the suffering of others, not even those who have caused our suffering. What I mean is that any story that conveys the victimhood of Palestinians as people living under military occupation, as people besieged in Gaza, as people who have been the targets of a campaign of ethnic cleansing, people deprived of their basic rights, will emotionally be blocked by a moral contest, a comparison. It is a comparison that defines Jews as the a priori victims. No matter what Palestinians suffer, their story will always be silently edited in the shadow of the real victim in the conflict. This links directly with the second truth that structures the shape of the human story the Palestinian is allowed to tell: Israel's right to exist. This is the taken for granted ideological fact that flows as an inevitable conclusion from Jews as the higher victim in this competition between victims. What I'm trying to unpack here is how in the very moment we are offered the chance to tell our story, we are robbed of that chance. And we are robbed of that chance because in front of each of our stories as Palestinians is a prologue written by our white universal human editor. It is a prologue that sets itself up as a substitute for our political context and history. It is a prologue that sets up the Palestinian human story as a story of being a victim, but not the most worthy victim. Because of the emotional weight of the Holocaust in a narrative that has constructed the flawed notion that Zionism was born out of the Holocaust, every Palestinian victim of Israeli aggression, apartheid, racism, and occupation can only be a victim to a certain point. At some point in their human story of tragedy and injustice, they must pass the baton of victimhood onto their oppressors and occupiers. And therein lies the perverse and intractable emotional impasse that thwarts our efforts to challenge the dominant narrative. Until this emotional regime is dismantled and Zionism is detangled from the tragedy of the Holocaust, our human stories will only soothe rather than confront the consciences of progressive journalists. Of course, the problem is that it is only possible to unpack these structural biases by providing historical context, the very context we are denied the opportunity to provide. Which brings me to my next point. One of the enduring frustrations when working with the media is this insistence on balance. This comes in various forms. In interviews, one often finds oneself having to speak and answer to the pro-Israeli side. In one interview, for example, even the headline on the webpage containing the podcast was explicit in selling this idea of balance and sides. We had guests from both sides of the conflict, it said. When I was introduced and my panellist, co-panellist, it was made clear that we were there to present both sides of the conflict. So there are a couple of things I want to say about this. Again, the emotional regimes that structure this orientation to the conflict is incredibly important to understand. There is a genuine sense that this is a conflict of equal sides, of relative truth, of a middle road if only the parties took steps to reach it. And it's really important to understand this in a wider context and to never underestimate how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is deeply entangled in the global cartography of racialized power hierarchies. In this specific instance, I'm referring to knowledge hierarchies that have constructed an image of the West based on Enlightenment conceits of so-called rationality, objectivity, neutrality, and reason, all considered exclusive and innate to the West. And we must never forget that Israel, as an extension of Europe among the barbarians of the Middle East, is also imagined in this image. Ramon Grossfugel calls this epistemic racism, or knowledge racism, in which, and I quote, the superiority of the West is taken for granted, and the epistemic privilege of Western identity politics from which to produce judgments of the other and global imperial designs around the world is an unquestioned presupposition. The result is a Western hegemonic identity politics and privilege that is sustained by certain myths. And one of these fundamental myths is what Colombian philosopher Santiago Castro Gomez called the point zero perspective. Ramon explains, the point zero perspective is the Western myth of a point of view that assumes itself to be beyond a point of view. This myth allowed Western men to claim its knowledge to be universal, neutral, and objective. What is the relevance of this to my analysis? I want to argue that this point zero perspective is stitched into our encounters with the media when it comes to the media's insistence on presenting both sides of the story. What this attempt at equivalence and being beyond a point of view obscures is, of course, that for Palestinians, this is a conflict where to claim to be beyond a point of view is in and of itself a statement of a point of view. Put another way, the claim that one is not taking sides is taking sides. How could it be otherwise? How can one remain balanced when the fact of Israeli military aggression, hegemony, belligerence, and defiance of international norms and laws is so clear? The sheer and grossly disproportionate imbalance in death tolls is evidence enough. Every time I am invited to speak with a pro-Israel spokesperson for balance, I have an image of a seesaw. The illusion of a balancing structure is there, but what counts is the weight distribution. Now, what is particularly insidious about this state of affairs is not that this is some conspiracy to catch us Palestinians out in a debate. It is worse, and it goes back to this deep-seated, conditioned racism that presumes that white Western values and knowledge are based on fairness, reason, neutrality. Once again, we must feel grateful for this benevolent opportunity to not only have a voice, but have a voice in a setting that smacks of some kind of Western civilized mission. How many times have you heard it? Why can't you just get along? Why can't you just negotiate? Why can't you hear each other out? The angry Arab just needs to sit in a room with a Zionist and learn to listen to the other side. This leads me to the next emotional constraint that we must face in our encounters with the media. It connects back to this idea of the human. What kind of human is a Palestinian allowed to be? What kind of Palestinian will we root for, listen to, sympathise with, take notice of? Think about the way violence is reported in this conflict. When Israelis are killed, the headlines are predictable. Wave of violence, new unrest, worst unrest, spike in violence. I think there are several deeper emotional complexes at play here. There is the obvious point that if it bleeds, it leads, and that this doesn't apply unless the blood is Israeli. There is no such thing as lapses or waves of violence for Palestinians. Every day is an encounter with violence, but that, I think, is a rather banal and self-evident point to make. The more I reflect on this, the more it links back to the wider global context of power hierarchies and how these shape Western emotional alliances. We love victims in the West who don't fight back, the stoic, self-restrained victim who doesn't resist or assume any agency. This is the victim, the brown victim, I mean, we can applaud and back to soothe our white conscience and maintain our hegemony. But at the risk of a sweeping and romanticised generalisation, I do think there is truth in the claim that Palestinians, women and children included, don't deliver the passive, doe-eyed brown figure of the victim. They yell at the cameras, they claim the right to revenge, they assert their indestructibility, demonstrate a fierce resilience and unwavering spirit of defiance. So the first thing is their defiance of a stereotype confronts a racialised image of the passive brown victim. But more than this even is the idea of provocation, because the Western imagination is limited by the luxuries of its privileged existence. the capacity to understand the pressure cooker that is life under occupation structures the way we think about Palestinians who resist. There is a deep-seated, self-centred conceit in referencing our lives when assessing how much Palestinians should take. It always amuses me, this idea that Palestinians are somehow excessive in their resistance, particularly when the vocally racist mobs speak up. We have entire collectives of enraged people ready to die for Australia because they cannot handle the outrage, the sheer unassailable injustice of a halal label on a jar of Vegemite. I think this really does speak to the topsy-turvy, wacky emotional regimes we are dealing with. Palestinians who are literally giving birth at checkpoints or watching their children killed by trigger-happy soldiers are either expected to live with it or, for others, are simply asking for it. It is the former position that interests me because it speaks to how people in the West divide the world between the West as a zone of safety and the third world as the zone of danger. Fear, bombs, and violence are not something that touches everyday life for Westerners. Violence and conflict being something that mainly affects cultural or ethnic others. We are shocked, disturbed, affected, provoked by violence. Palestinians, non-Westerners, only know and understand violence. You can see here that even one's capacity to endure is based on a racial hierarchy. But there is a flip side to this, of course, because we are reminded endlessly of Israel's right to defend itself. No state can tolerate rockets, we are reminded whenever Gaza is in the media. What is the emotional logic that transforms offence to defence and defence to offence? It is a racial one. Just under 3,000 Americans were murdered in the attacks on the Twin Towers on September 11, 2001. The attack was deemed the ultimate provocation to war, and revenge was exacted, resulting in the killing of millions and millions of Muslims in the war on terror. So it is not that we in the West do not understand the defence of provocation. What we do not understand is how to imagine that anybody besides ourselves has the right to provocation, the right to anger, to resist, to fight back. And this is because the docile, passive, brown person is the only human we are willing to tolerate, and by extension, the angry, defiant, provoked Palestinian is unacceptable. It is the why in this equation that is most sobering. To imagine that Palestinians can be provoked to the horror of stabbings or rockets is to undo a whole lot of emotional labour. It means that Palestinians just might be the victims in this conflict. It means that the conditions of their lives under occupation must be worse than we have allowed ourselves to believe. It means the narrative of right to exist and Israel's right to defend itself and peace talks and two-state solution might collapse. And this is why our engagement with the media needs to chip away at these emotional blocks, exposing how flimsy and false the foundation of Israel's narrative and propaganda are. The political and historical context is structured by an emotional context that enrolls a global racial world historical order. Divestment here, then, is also about encouraging an emotional divestment from Israel. It seems to me that is where the labour must also be invested if we are ever to excavate the false narratives that are buried deep in the media structure. Thank you.